So here we are. This is part 2 of the Rachel Nichol case. Before we continue, if you haven't watched part 1, you need to. None of what comes next will make sense without it. I'll give a short recap in a moment, but seriously, go watch it first. This is part of a 3-part story, and the next chapter will be coming in a few days. So make sure you're following along. Let's rewind a bit. Rachel Nichol, just 23 years old, was murdered one quiet morning in July 1992 while out walking on Wimbledon Common with her 2-year-old son, Alex. He saw everything, and because he was the only eyewitness, police worked as gently and creatively as they could to get a description from him. With time, and with help from 2 other women who had seen a man behaving suspiciously that morning, one by the trees, the other by the stream, they were finally able to create a composite sketch. This sketch, along with a criminal profile built by psychologist Paul Britton, was released to the public. It aired on the news. It aired on Crime Watch. And that same night, the phone lines lit up. Call after call came in, all pointing to the same man. One name, again and again. People saying, "It looks like him. I think it's him. You should look into this guy." The man they were talking about was Colin Stagg. And on paper, Colin seemed to fit everything Paul Britton had described. He was 29 years old, single. He lived less than 2 miles from Wimbledon Common. He lived alone. He was unemployed. He had no long-term romantic relationships, no social ties to speak of. He even looked like the police sketch. To detectives, this wasn't just a strong lead. It was the first real lead they'd had in over 2 months. And with pressure mounting from the public, the press, and a looming fear that this man could strike again, they moved quickly. Too quickly. The very next morning, police went to Colin Stagg's home, and they arrested him on suspicion of the murder of Rachel Nichol. But here's the thing. They had no evidence. None. Not a weapon. Not DNA. Not bloodstains. Not fibers. Not even a timeline that connected him to the scene in any concrete way. They had his name, repeated by callers. They had a physical resemblance to a composite sketch. And they had a profile, a psychological guess. But nothing forensic. Nothing solid. Still, the pressure was immense. This case had gripped the country. People were afraid. The media was growing more aggressive by the day. And the police knew they needed to be seen doing something. So when they sat Colin down for questioning at the station, they already had a conclusion in mind. One of the very first questions they asked was, "Were you on Wimbledon Common the morning Rachel Nichol was murdered?" And Colin answered honestly, yes. At that moment, it didn't matter what else he said. It didn't matter why he was there. It didn't matter what he'd seen or whether he had any connection to Rachel. The moment he confirmed that he had, in fact, been on the Common that morning, the police were done searching. In their minds, they had found their man. He was there. He fit the profile. He matched the sketch. That was enough. Or at least they thought it was. So police asked Colin Stagg what exactly he was doing at Wimbledon Common that morning. And he told them a story that, at least on the surface, sounded ordinary, even harmless. He said that he went out very early that morning, earlier than usual. He had a dog, and just like Rachel walking Molly, he walked his dog on Wimbledon Common almost every day. It was part of his routine, something peaceful, familiar. That morning, he explained he wasn't feeling well. He had a headache, felt a bit under the weather. So instead of doing his usual long walk through the trees, he cut it short. Just a quick 10 to 15 minutes, and then he headed home. He said he wanted to take some painkillers and lie down, try to sleep it off. According to Colin, by the time he was leaving Wimbledon Common, Rachel and Alex were likely still in the car, on their way there. Meaning, in his version, they never even crossed paths. He said he got home, looked after himself, and started to feel a bit better maybe an hour later. So he decided to head back out, take the dog for a second walk. But by the time he returned to the Common, the entire place had changed. It was taped off, swarming with police. Something had happened. Something serious. Colin said he approached one of the officers stationed near the entrance and asked what was going on. The officer told him that a body had been found. Colin, surprised and trying to be helpful, mentioned that he had been on the Common earlier that day and offered to give his details in case they needed to speak with him. He said he hadn't seen anything suspicious, but he wanted to help however he could. That officer took down Colin's information, but no one ever followed up. He simply went back home with his dog, thinking, well, at least they got their short walk in that morning. That was his story. That was his version of events from the morning of Rachel Nichols' murder. And to be fair, it sounded plausible, even boring. But something about it started raising eyebrows in the interview room. The timing was convenient, just early enough to say he was there, in case someone else spotted him, but just before the murder, so he could say he wasn't involved. When police pressed further, Colin started showing signs of discomfort. They said he was avoiding questions, not directly answering things, instead taking detours and rambling responses. He would change the subject, reinterpret the question, stumble over his words. He didn't come across as confident or clear. Not guilty necessarily, but definitely not smooth. And then there was the timeline. Colin gave police a broad window. He said he probably left the house sometime between 8 and 9, which even in 1992 seemed oddly vague. Sure, there were no mobile phones, but clocks existed. Watches existed. If you're walking your dog every morning, wouldn't you know your usual time? Then came the neighbor's statement. One of Colin's neighbors said they'd seen him leaving his house at 9:20 a.m. That time, if accurate, was much closer to the time of the murder. In fact, it might have even overlapped with Rachel and Alex being on the common. Suddenly, his alibi was slipping. There was another detail that police found worth digging into. Colin mentioned that while he was on the common, he saw a woman with brown hair tied back in a bun, pushing a baby in a pram, accompanied by a stocky, bald man, who he described as her boyfriend. Descriptions like that mattered, because on the morning of Rachel's murder, police had collected names and descriptions of every single person they could find on Wimbledon Common as part of their emergency lockdown. If they could match Colin's description of the couple to actual people whose details were recorded, it might support his alibi. If they couldn't, if those people didn't exist, it could mean he was making the whole thing up. It wasn't proof. Not yet. But slowly, piece by piece, a sense of suspicion was starting to build. Police were getting increasingly frustrated. They had a composite sketch. They had a profile. They had dozens of names from tip-offs. But one name just kept circling back, Colin Stagg. He lived nearby, fit the sketch, matched the profile, and now they were getting deeper into his world. They started rechecking their records from the day of the murder. Everyone who had been on Wimbledon Common. Officers had collected names, contact details, even brief physical descriptions of people on site that morning. But strangely, there was no record of the people Colin claimed to have seen. He said he'd spoken briefly with a couple, a woman with brown hair tied back in a bun, pushing a pram, accompanied by her large, bald boyfriend. But according to the official log, no one matching that description had been recorded on the common that day. Not a woman with a bun. Not a man with a pram. No baby. Nothing. Of course, police gave Colin the benefit of the doubt for a moment. Maybe it was just bad memory. Maybe he was mixing up days. But still, something felt off. Was this a genuine mistake from someone trying to cooperate with the investigation? Or was it a lie? A carefully constructed alibi? And then it just kept snowballing. Given the rising suspicion, the police decided it was time to dig deeper. They got a search warrant to comb through Colin Stagg's flat in Roehampton. At this point, they were looking for anything at all, that might connect him to the murder of Rachel Nichols. And what they found inside would make the headlines for weeks. In one of the bedrooms, positioned right in front of a window, officers found a white painted pentagram drawn on the floor. A large one. That image alone sent alarm bells ringing. To the police, this wasn't just eccentric decor. This looked like ritualistic symbolism. Something dark. Something satanic. Could it have been part of a ritual killing? It didn't stop there. The walls of the room had all been painted black, and on top of the black, in white paint, were dozens of symbols. Goat heads, deities, esoteric sigils. All of it eerily pointed towards some sort of occult obsession. Officers began to think, what if this wasn't just a random killing? What if it was a ritualistic sacrifice? When confronted about the bizarre decor, Colin had a story ready. He claimed that it wasn't his doing. According to him, the flat used to belong to his brother, and it was his brother who had painted the walls, drawn the symbols, left behind the pentagram. Colin claimed that he simply never got around to repainting or renovating the place when he moved in. But let's be honest, most people wouldn't feel comfortable sleeping in a room like that, let alone living in it for years. To the police, his explanation didn't just feel flimsy, it felt deliberately evasive. And then came more findings. In a corner of the room, police uncovered a black hooded cloak, heavy, ceremonial in style. Nearby was a collection of books on Satanism, the occult, and ritualistic practices. These weren't some dusty hand-me-downs either. They looked well-used, dog-eared, studied. Now the question was, were these also left by the brother? Or was this Colin's real interest all along? Also found were a pair of leather gloves and a long-bladed knife. The knife was tested and later confirmed not to be the murder weapon. But the combination, cloak, gloves, knife, occult symbols, painted a disturbing picture of a man with dark tendencies. Maybe not conclusive, but definitely unnerving. With their suspicions rising, police moved to the next step. They wanted to see if anyone could identify Colin. They placed him in a classic police lineup. 5 men, similar builds, similar appearances. And then they called in a crucial witness. One of the women who had seen a man acting suspiciously at Wimbledon Common, the same one who had called police after the sketch aired, was asked to observe the lineup. She stood behind the one-way mirror, scanning the 5 faces. And without hesitation, she pointed directly at Colin Stagg. "That's him," she said. "That's the guy." The very same man she had seen that morning, lurking around the wooded area, seemingly trying to hide his face. So now, things are looking even worse for Colin Stagg. He matched the sketch. He fit the criminal profile. He lived minutes from the scene. He had a story that didn't quite hold. And now, a witness had picked him out of a lineup. But it still wasn't enough. Not legally. Not for a charge. Police couldn't yet prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. Everything they had was circumstantial, and if they wanted to arrest him for real, they needed more. And so, they were trying to get a little bit more circumstantial. At this stage in the investigation, police were becoming increasingly convinced that Colin Stagg was hiding something. The witness identification, the pentagram and symbols in his apartment, the cloak, the books, everything pointed to a man who wasn't just odd, but perhaps dangerously unstable. Still, suspicion is not proof. And in the absence of solid forensic evidence tying him to Rachel Nichols' murder, detectives knew they needed something more, something that could solidify this growing mountain of circumstantial threads into a compelling case. So they decided to take a step back and look into Colin Stagg's criminal history. Maybe there was a pattern. Maybe there were previous offenses that could help illuminate who this man really was. And that's when the past revealed a detail that sent a jolt through the entire investigation team. Years earlier, Colin Stagg had been arrested for indecent exposure. And not just anywhere. He was arrested on Wimbledon Common, the exact same location where Rachel Nichols had been murdered. Same place, same man, same unsettling behavior. It was impossible to ignore. If that wasn't enough, the arrest had occurred in the same wooded area where Rachel's body was found. Police couldn't believe what they were reading. It felt too specific to be coincidence. And it got even more disturbing when they recalled Paul Britton's criminal profile from earlier in the investigation. Remember, Britton had predicted that the killer would likely have a past involving sexually motivated offenses. Things like harassment, indecent exposure, or even more severe sexual crimes. This wasn't a match. This was an exact fit. But oddly enough, Colin had never been formally charged for the incident. It seemed that the matter had either been dropped or dismissed. Legally speaking, it didn't leave a lasting mark on his record. But the police weren't about to let it slide this time. So they brought him back in for another interview, sitting him down once again under the harsh fluorescent lights, recorders rolling, notebooks ready. One of the officers looked across the table and asked him directly, "Did you expose yourself on Wimbledon Common?" And without hesitation, Colin Stagg said yes. Just like that. No panic, no denial, just a flat, matter-of-fact confession. He even elaborated. Said he was sunbathing. Said it was something he did every year. With a shrug, he admitted he liked to take off all his clothes and lie out in the sun, naked, in the middle of a public park, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. And it got worse. The woman who had reported him at the time, the one who had seen him naked on the common, had told officers that he wasn't just lying there. She said he had an erection. That detail, chilling in its own right, took on a darker tone when you considered the fact that families walked their children through that park. That there were parents, babies, toddlers, and yet here was a grown man lying fully exposed and visibly aroused in the open. It was disgusting. It was deliberate. And now it was on record. Police weren't expecting a confession like that. Not in the middle of a murder investigation. But they saw an opportunity. Even if they couldn't yet charge him for Rachel Nichols' murder, they could at least charge him with this indecent exposure, now that he'd freely admitted it. So they did. They booked him. He went to court, and though the legal system didn't hand down a harsh sentence, he ended up with only a 200 pounds fine. It gave detectives something else. Time. A legal excuse to keep Colin in their sights, to keep him under pressure, and hopefully to find more evidence connecting him to the murder. But in the court of public opinion, Colin Stagg was already guilty. Once the media got hold of that indecent exposure confession, they went absolutely wild. It was front-page news. The man suspected of murdering a young mother in the park was also now a self-admitted sex offender and had been caught doing perverse things in that very same park. The tabloids ran with it. They plastered his name and face on every cover. They didn't hold back. And as much as it's important for the public to stay informed, this wasn't responsible journalism. They weren't just reporting on a suspect. They were branding him as the murderer. Before a trial, before a formal charge, before any conviction. That kind of public shaming can destroy a person, especially if it turns out he's not the one who did it. And it was around this point in the investigation where a woman named Julie had seen all of these newspaper reports of Colin Stagg, the murder suspect, and she decided to get in touch with police because she had her own experiences with Colin Stagg in the past. Julie had known Colin Stagg about 2 years before Rachel Nichols' murder. They didn't meet through mutual friends or bump into each other by chance. No, their connection came from something that feels almost vintage now, but in the 1990s, it was a surprisingly common way to meet someone. The Lonely Hearts column in the newspaper. If you're not familiar, it was essentially an old-school dating section where people would write small ads describing themselves and the kind of partner they were looking for. Things like, I'm a 5'5" redhead, kind-hearted, and looking for someone to laugh with over coffee, followed by a phone number or postal address. If someone liked the sound of your ad, they'd reach out, maybe write a letter, maybe give you a call. Julie had placed one of those ads, and Colin saw it. He liked the way she described herself. Perhaps it was the simplicity or the warmth in her words, and he decided to write her a letter. It was polite, friendly, just a little introduction. Julie read it and replied. There was nothing strange about it at first. Just two people exchanging letters, getting to know each other slowly in that careful, thoughtful rhythm that only handwritten correspondence allows. They wrote back and forth for a short while. A few phone calls happened too. And for a moment, it seemed like something might blossom. Julie thought he was a little odd, but not in a way that raised alarm bells. At least not yet. But then things changed. Out of nowhere, Colin sent her a different kind of letter. Not a polite one, not the kind that asked about her day or talked about the weather. This one was unsettling. It was sexual, deeply, inappropriately so. Julie hadn't asked for it. She hadn't hinted at anything romantic, let alone sexual. But here was Colin, sending her a graphic letter describing his fantasies. And not just any fantasies, but ones that immediately set off every instinct in her body. He described wanting to have sex with her outside, in nature. He talked about using a knife. He detailed fantasies involving holding her at knife point. It wasn't just creepy, it was terrifying. And more than anything, it felt wrong. Julie hadn't expected any of this. They were barely acquaintances, and now she was reading words that made her skin crawl. The way he wrote about her, as if she were just a character in his disturbing fantasy, made her feel violated, even though they'd never met in person. So, Julie cut off all contact. She stopped replying. She never called him again. She wanted absolutely nothing to do with Colin Stagg after that. But she never forgot that letter, and she didn't throw it away either. Something about it, the unease, the instinct, made her hold on to it. She kept it tucked away in a drawer in her home. For 2 years, it stayed there, gathering dust, forgotten but not gone, because in the back of her mind, she had a a feeling that maybe one day that letter would matter. So, Julie, the same Julie who had received that disturbing letter from Colin Stagg years earlier, decided she couldn't ignore it anymore. After seeing his name all over the papers and hearing he was a suspect in Rachel Nichols' murder, she pulled that letter out of the drawer where it had sat for 2 years and brought it straight to the police. And when the detectives read it, something changed. That letter, vile and unsolicited as it was, gave them an idea, a new angle, a fresh approach to finally get something solid on Colin Stagg. Up until this point, they were running in circles with circumstantial leads, inconsistencies, and a growing pile of media pressure. But this letter, this disturbing little window into Colin's fantasy world, it felt like the key. And that's when they launched what would soon become one of the most controversial operations in Metropolitan Police history. They called it Operation Edsel. Now, just a quick warning. This entire plan, from start to finish, sounds like it was ripped straight from a bad crime drama. And it's genuinely one of the most ethically questionable decisions you'll ever hear a major police force make. The idea? To send in an undercover policewoman, someone trained to manipulate, seduce, and get close, and have her pose as a romantic interest to Colin Stagg. They wanted her to earn his trust, flirt with him, build a connection, and then, hopefully, lead him to confess. Yes, you heard that right. Their actual strategy was seduce a lonely man and hope he admits to murder. The woman they chose for this job was codenamed Lizzie James. That wasn't her real name, of course. It was just the alias she used for the duration of Operation Edsel. Her character, the story she crafted for Stagg, was that of a friend of Julie's. Remember, Julie from the Lonely Hearts ad. So the first move was for Lizzie to write to Colin as if she were this friend. In the letter, she claimed that she had been visiting Julie a few weeks ago, and while she was there, she stumbled across the infamous fantasy letter he had written. But unlike Julie, Lizzie wasn't disgusted. No, Lizzie claimed to be intrigued. She painted herself as someone who shared those same dark, forbidden desires, someone who liked what Colin had to say. She even went so far as to tell him, "Julie's so boring and old-fashioned, but me? I'm into all that same stuff as you." It was a fake connection, carefully crafted to disarm him. And it worked. Colin, who was 29 at the time and still a virgin, was thrilled. For a man who had long felt isolated, misunderstood, and desperate for affection, this letter was like a lifeline. Someone out there liked him. Someone wanted to talk to him. Someone might even want to be with him. He wrote back quickly, eagerly, and over the next 7 months, the two of them exchanged 43 letters. That's right. Nearly 4 dozen letters back and forth between Colin and a woman who didn't actually exist. For Colin, it must have felt like a real relationship, a real emotional bond. He opened up. He shared pieces of himself. He believed he was finally being seen, finally being understood. But in reality, it wasn't just Lizzie reading those letters. It was a whole team of officers behind her, reviewing every word, analyzing his responses, crafting the perfect replies to pull him in deeper. They were all working together to write as this woman, guiding the conversation in hopes of triggering a confession. It was manipulative. It was invasive. It was unethical. And Operation Edsel has since been widely condemned by nearly every legal and ethical expert who's looked into it. Many have gone as far as to call it a honey trap, because honestly, that's exactly what it was. A setup designed to lure a lonely man into saying something he never would have shared under normal circumstances. Now, the police did try to set some boundaries. There were official ground rules in place for this operation. And rule number 1, the most important one, was that the officer could not bring up anything sexual first. Ever. Anything and everything sexual had to be brought up by Colin Stagg first. They couldn't, try and pull it out of him that way. Once he brought something up, they were very much allowed to talk about it, elaborate on it, reflect that conversation back to him, but they couldn't be the ones to initiate that. So here's how it worked. Colin would mention one of his fantasies, some strange or twisted idea he had, and the team behind Lizzie James would respond with encouragement. They'd say things like, "Oh, tell me more," or "What else would you do to me?" Every time I read this part of the case, it's all a big fat cringe for me. not just because of what's being said, but because of how obviously performative the whole thing was. The manipulation was clear, and the fact that it was coming from law enforcement, that made it worse. You see, from the very beginning of Operation Edsel, there was supposed to be one major ground rule. They were not allowed to initiate any sexual content. That meant every explicit or dark detail had to come from Colin himself. If he never brought it up, they weren't supposed to either. But as it turns out, that rule didn't last long. In fact, it quickly crumbled. As the letters continued, it became increasingly obvious that the operation wasn't just unethical. It was sloppy, manipulative, and borderline entrapment. They claimed they were just building trust, gaining insight into Colin's psyche. But really, they were trying to lure him into a confession that may never have come on its own. They were pushing him hard. Some of the letters that Lizzie sent were deeply concerning. She began writing things like, "I want you to dominate me," or "I want you to overpower me, humiliate me, make me feel defenseless and scared." These weren't harmless flirtations. They were targeted emotional triggers. And the police knew exactly what they were doing. They were choosing their words with purpose, fully aware that Colin had written about knife fantasies in the past. So they leaned into it. They dangled those fantasies like bait, knowing how lonely he was, knowing how desperate he was for a connection. And of course, Colin, emotionally vulnerable and intensely eager for affection, responded the way they hoped he would. He wrote back, saying things that he thought Lizzie James wanted to hear. Whether those things were real fantasies of his or just desperate attempts to please her, we'll never really know. But he was convinced that the more graphic he was, the more she'd be interested in him. And that was all he wanted for someone to want him. It wasn't just one or two letters. It was a consistent pattern. Lizzie would say things like, "You're holding back," or "Be more dominating," or "Tell me more, make me feel powerless." Over and over, she kept pushing him to escalate, pushing him beyond what he'd said in his previous letters, drawing out darker and darker details. And that was exactly what they weren't supposed to be doing. If you remember, rule number 1 was crystal clear: do not encourage him, do not lead him. But here they were, dangling provocative language, rewarding him for feeding into it, even pressuring him when he didn't go far enough. Colin, for his part, seemed constantly unsure. After he shared something sexual, particularly if it was extreme or violent, he would often ask, "Is this what you want? Or is this the kind of thing you're into?" It was like he was trying to read the room, afraid he might go too far, say too much, and scare her off. And you know what? That tracked, because that's exactly what had happened with Julie. He had sent her that graphic fantasy letter years ago, and she had immediately cut all contact. He was terrified of that happening again. You could sense it in his tone, in the way he structured his letters. He was trying to play it safe, even as he let himself say things he wasn't sure were okay. And you could tell. You could tell that he was always trying to get her consent throughout this. Eventually, the fake relationship between Lizzie James and Colin Stagg moved beyond the page. After months of exchanging letters, 43 in total, things finally escalated to phone calls. And once those calls began, the tone started to shift. The conversations, at first light and flirtatious, soon veered into darker territory. Lizzie, or rather the undercover operation behind her, carefully nudged the topic toward the Rachel Nichol murder. That was the real goal here. It was never just about building rapport. They wanted a confession. But despite all the pressure they were trying to build around him, the emotionally loaded letters, the suggestive tone of the calls, Colin never once confessed to anything. He never gave up any details that would even remotely count as incriminating. And that, of course, was a huge disappointment to the team running Operation Edsel. They had hoped he would crack by now, but he didn't. Still, the team wasn't ready to call it quits. Not even close. So they kept going. Keep writing. Keep calling. Keep pushing. And then, after all those months of staged intimacy, Colin and Lizzie finally agreed to meet in person. It was the next step, the big one, the moment they'd all been waiting for and planning for. Now, just pause here for a second, because let's talk about how dangerous this whole plan was. This was a man they believed might be a sexually motivated killer, a man they suspected of brutally murdering a woman in broad daylight. and they were about to send a woman, completely alone, to meet him face to face in a public park. It sounds absurd, like something out of a reckless crime novel. Sure, they said there would be police officers dotted around the area. Undercover surveillance. People watching from a distance, ready to intervene if things went south. But let's be honest, if Colin Stagg had pulled out a knife at that moment, if he had really been the killer they believed he was, there's no way any officer would have reached her in time. It was an insane risk. Still, they set the plan in motion. They chose the location. Colin and Lizzie would meet in Hyde Park, right in the heart of London. And if that wasn't unsettling enough, they chose a park. A park, just like the one where Rachel Nichol had been murdered. The parallels were chilling. The danger is obvious. So, on the day of the meeting, the Met Police had already been at Hyde Park for hours. They had plainclothes officers scattered around, eyes peeled, radios on, watching and waiting for Colin to arrive. And he did. In fact, he showed up early. That alone raised some eyebrows. Why was he early? Was he setting something up? Was he preparing something? Or maybe he was just the kind of person who showed up early to things. No one really knew, but the unease was there. It lingered. And while he waited for Lizzie, Colin stood alone under a tree. It was raining that day, light drizzle coming down through the branches, but he just stood there, still and calm, people watching in the park. Then, finally, he saw her. Lizzie James, the woman he'd been writing to, fantasizing about, growing closer to over the past 7 months. He walked over. He greeted her. They smiled, exchanged a few words. Then they started to walk, just two people on a casual stroll through the park. And it's worth mentioning, this wasn't just any day. It was actually Colin Stagg's birthday, which makes the entire operation feel even worse. Imagine that, being unknowingly lured into a fake first date on your birthday by someone pretending to care about you, just to see if you'd accidentally confess to a murder you may or may not have committed. And because it was his birthday, Lizzie James even brought him presents. She gave him a brand new stereo and a baseball cap. But what Colin didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have known, was that the only reason she gave him that baseball cap was so she could encourage him to wear it that day, so that he would stand out to the police that were watching them even more. So the two of them continued their little stroll through Hyde Park, side by side. From a distance, it might have looked like a casual date, just two people enjoying a walk together in the rain. But it was anything but ordinary. This was the culmination of months of planning, months of manipulation. And now, the trap was tightening. Eventually, they made their way into a cafe tucked inside the park. One of those small, slightly touristy places with a view of the trees and a few scattered tables. This was all prearranged by the police. The cafe had been chosen because it provided the perfect vantage point for surveillance. Officers in plain clothes were already positioned around the area, some posing as cafe patrons, some outside with discreet communication lines. Every angle of this meeting was covered. But make no mistake, this wasn't some improvised conversation. The Met had worked meticulously with criminal profiler Paul Britton to craft a psychological strategy for this exact moment. Lizzie James wasn't being left to improvise or just see what happens. She was given a script, a dark, disturbing script. The plan was simple in structure, but deeply manipulative in nature. Lizzie was going to lean in close, lower her voice, and tell Colin that she had a dark secret. Not just any secret, a taboo one, something twisted and forbidden. The idea was to frame it like a seductive confession, something she wanted to share but felt conflicted about. She was told to act hesitant, vulnerable, and let Colin pull the secret out of her. The hope was that in doing so, he'd feel a strange sense of intimacy, of trust, and then maybe he'd share a dark secret of his own. And disturbingly, it worked. At least, the first part did. Lizzie delivered the line. She leaned in, eyes soft, voice low, and said, "I've got something to tell you, but I don't know if I should." Colin, just as they predicted, reassured her. He told her it was okay. She could trust him. Whatever it was, he wouldn't judge her. And then she told him this horrifying, elaborate story. Lizzie James told Colin Stagg that she had once been deeply involved in the occult, that her ex-boyfriend had introduced her to Satanism, that they had performed rituals together. But not just rituals, sacrifices. She said that one night, as part of a satanic rite, she and a group of others had murdered a pregnant woman and her unborn baby. She claimed they had slit the woman's throat on an altar, collected the blood in a cup, and drank it. Then, in the most grotesque twist, she said they all had an orgy around the altar afterward. It was one of the most disturbing, fake confessions imaginable. And none of it was real. This entire backstory was fabricated by police to bait Colin into thinking he wasn't alone, that he could trust her, that she was one of them. And how did he react? Not the way anyone expected. Colin didn't flinch, didn't recoil in horror. His face didn't even twitch. He sat there, calmly listening as she detailed the murder of a mother and her unborn child, and the grotesque celebration that followed. And then he just moved on, as if she'd told him she once jaywalked. The Met found this deeply suspicious. After all, how many people could hear something that disturbing and not react? The date wrapped up not long after. Colin walked Lizzie to the edge of the park and flagged down a taxi for her. But before she left, he handed her something, a folded note. Another letter, one of his infamous sexual fantasies, something he'd written in advance. And when Lizzie handed that note over to the police, they were floored. This wasn't just fantasy. It felt like a mirror of Rachel Nichols' murder. In the letter, Colin wrote in graphic detail about wanting to take Lizzie to Wimbledon Common. He described threatening her with a knife during sex, cutting her, watching the blood flow, and the sexual pleasure he derived from it. It was disturbing, brutal, and eerily specific. To the Met Police, this was no longer just suspicious behavior. This was confirmation. This had to be him. Who else could have written something so on the nose? A sexual knife fantasy, set in the same park, with the same horrifying violence. What were the chances that two men existed with the exact same violent urges, at the exact same place, on the exact same day? They were convinced this had to be Rachel Nichols' killer. But still, it wasn't enough. A sexual fantasy wasn't a confession, and they needed that confession to make a charge stick. So they sent Lizzie James back in. This time, she'd wear a wire, and they would try again. They'd try to coax a confession in real time, in her voice, captured in crystal clear audio. She brought up the case, the fact that Colin was a suspect in the murder. They'd talked about it before, casually, but now they needed him to say something. Anything. And he did talk. He admitted to being a suspect, but then he paused and said that he didn't do it. He assured her that he didn't do it, that he'd never done anything like that it just wasn't him. Lizzie James listened quietly as Colin repeated his denial. Once again, he told her that he had nothing to do with Rachel Nichols' murder, that it wasn't him, that he wasn't capable of such a thing. And this time, Lizzie responded differently. She didn't press him further about evidence or facts. Instead, she leaned into the fantasy. She began to tell him that the idea of him being a murder suspect actually excited her, that it turned her on, that the thought of being with someone who had taken a life, someone who had it in them to commit something that dark and irreversible, was deeply erotic to her. She told him she wanted to be with someone dangerous, someone capable of murder. And she made it sound like this wasn't just a passing thought, but one of her deepest fantasies, that having sex with someone like that would fulfill her in a way no one else ever had. And then it got even worse. She began implying, more and more directly, that she wouldn't sleep with Colin unless he had actually killed someone, unless he could prove to her that he was capable of that kind of darkness. It wasn't subtle. She would say things like, "If only you had killed Rachel Nichols, then this would be perfect." She was laying it out clearly. Give me a confession, and you'll get what you want. Now, keep in mind, this wasn't just manipulation. This was a psychological trap set for a man who was, by every account, deeply lonely. A man who had gone nearly 3 decades without any real romantic or sexual connection, and who now believed that he might finally be close to something real. That maybe, just maybe, someone wanted him. It's hard to overstate just how desperate he was. And it makes this tactic by police feel incredibly dark. Predatory, even. And yet, despite all of this, Colin stuck to his story. He didn't give her what she wanted. He didn't confess. He said, "Look, I'm terribly sorry, but that's just not me. I'm not a murderer. I didn't do that. I'm not capable of doing that. I'm not the guy that you want." But here's where things took another disturbing turn. Desperate to keep her attention, to make her happy, to still fulfill what he believed were her fantasies, Colin began making up stories. Stories about murder. Fake confessions, in a way, but crafted as fantasies, not reality. He knew what she wanted to hear, and he gave it to her, not because it was true, but because he thought that's what would keep her around. In fact, one of the most unsettling things he did was tell Lizzie James that he had inside knowledge of Rachel Nichols' murder. He said that, because he was a suspect, police had shown him a crime scene photo, and from that he claimed he could tell how Rachel's body had been found. Lizzie, of course, played into it. She seemed fascinated, encouraged him, and then, in what would later become one of the most damning moments in the whole operation, Colin got down on the ground. This was at another one of their park dates, being monitored closely by officers, and he physically reenacted the way Rachel's body had been positioned when it was discovered. He curled in his arms, arranged himself to match what he claimed he'd seen in the photo. Her hands crossed or pressed together. The details were strikingly accurate. But here's the twist. According to the police, they never showed him that photo. At least, not one that included her hands. So how did he know? It was chilling. To the police watching this moment unfold, it looked like confirmation. The guy they'd suspected all along was now mimicking the position of the victim's body in graphic detail and claiming it was based on a photo they didn't believe he could have seen. And yet there he was doing it. It was another piece on the growing pile of circumstantial evidence. At this point, it wasn't just one or two suspicious things. The list was growing longer by the week. He had been picked out in a lineup. He looked like the man in the sketch. He'd been at the Common that morning, at a suspicious time, with a loose alibi. He'd written graphic sexual letters that mirrored the exact method of Rachel's killing. He hadn't flinched when Lizzie described a grotesque double murder of a pregnant woman and her unborn child. And now, he was recreating the crime scene on the ground for her. Casually, calmly. To the police, it all painted a very clear picture. So by now it all mounted up against him, and police were sure that this was their guy, so why wait any longer? On August 17th, 1993, the Metropolitan Police finally made their move. Colin Stagg, now 30 years old, was arrested on suspicion of murdering Rachel Nichols. It had been more than a year since her brutal killing on Wimbledon Common, and after months of building their case through Operation Edsel, officers believed they had enough to bring him in. But this wasn't just a quick arrest. It launched an even deeper search for hard evidence. They wanted something tangible, something that would finally connect Colin to the crime beyond what they already had. So, while Colin sat in custody at the police station, teams were back at his home, tearing it apart again. They weren't just checking drawers and wardrobes this time. They were out in the garden, digging up the soil, searching for anything he might have buried. A weapon, a piece of clothing, anything. The level of intensity in this search made it clear that police were certain they had the right man. And while all of this was going on outside, inside the station, Colin Stagg was about to experience something most of us could never imagine. They sat him down, and finally, they told him the truth. The woman he'd been writing to for the past year, the one he'd bared his soul to, shared his fantasies with, spoken to on the phone, met in the park, gone on walks with, that woman didn't exist. Not really. Lizzie James wasn't her name. She wasn't interested in him. She wasn't in love with him. She was an undercover police officer. And for an entire year, every word she'd said had been part of a covert operation to trick him into confessing to Rachel Nichols' murder. They came clean about everything. They told him about the sting, about the letters he received, about the scripts they wrote as a team, all designed to provoke and manipulate. They told him every date was monitored. Every phone call was recorded. Every moment of contact was coordinated behind the scenes. And then, just when it couldn't feel more humiliating, they brought her in. Lizzie James. Not her real name, of course, but the woman he believed he had a genuine connection with. She entered the room, sat across from him, and introduced herself formally as a police officer. She apologized, said it was just her job. But for Colin, it was like watching the entire world around him collapse. He sat there, heartbroken and exposed, while officers confronted him with every disturbing thing he'd ever said to her. Every sexual fantasy involving knives, blood, control, laid out before him like evidence. They told him that this wasn't just disturbing, it was incriminating. They believed those letters weren't just fantasies. They were confessions in disguise. And they kept going. They brought up the moment in Hyde Park where he reenacted how Rachel's body had been found. They asked, "Why did you know her hand were crossed?" He answered carefully. He said he hadn't meant anything by it. He was brushing dirt off his palms after kneeling on the ground. He insisted that whatever gesture he made, it was coincidental. He said he'd seen a crime scene photo, but in the image the police had shown him, her hands weren't visible. He didn't know they were crossed. If it looked like a reenactment, it wasn't meant to be. Then they asked him another question. When Lizzie told you that she'd murdered a pregnant woman and her unborn child, why didn't you react? Why didn't you flinch or act shocked? Why did you just accept it? Colin said it was because he didn't believe her. He thought Lizzie was mentally ill, that her story sounded so extreme, so bizarre, that he genuinely believed she was delusional. He assumed she wasn't a killer at all, just a woman struggling with mental illness, making things up. And, as he explained, he didn't want to upset her. He didn't want to embarrass her or make her feel worse. He figured it was best just to go along with it. Play along politely, because in his eyes, she was someone who liked him, someone who was showing him attention, something he was desperate for. And if her ideas were strange, or dark, or delusional, well, that didn't matter so much to him, because he said that if he genuinely thought she was a murderer, he would have called the police. He would have actually, taken this further, but he just thought that this woman was mentally ill, and she was interested in him. So he was willing to just go along with whatever she said so that he could sleep with her in the end, which is a bit gross. And he was also just being polite as well. If this woman was actually mentally ill, he didn't want to sit across from her and make her feel weird and make her feel bad for having these thoughts and delusions and things, because he knew that if she was mentally ill, she couldn't help it. So he wasn't going to sit there and react and make her feel like a monster when he didn't think she'd actually even killed anyone. At the end of the day, when you stripped it all back, the wiretaps, the letters, the covert meetings in the park, what it came down to was this. Colin Stagg was a painfully lonely man. He had been alone for so long, with no romantic connection, no deep friendships. So when anyone, finally showed him attention, he clung to it. He wasn't thinking about the consequences. He wasn't thinking about red flags. He was thinking about not losing what felt like his only chance at love. And that's why he went along with it. That's why he listened to all of Lizzie James' fantasies, no matter how bizarre. That's why he stayed. Because in his mind, this might have been the closest he'd ever get to a real relationship. He didn't want to let it go. But the police didn't buy it. Not for 1 second. No matter what Colin said, no matter how many times he insisted he wasn't a killer, the Metropolitan Police were convinced that he was. They had poured over a year of work into this sting operation, and they believed they were closer than they'd ever been to solving one of the UK's most high-profile murders. Even if the case wasn't perfect, even if the evidence wasn't solid, they weren't about to back off. Public pressure was intense, the media were relentless, and they needed an arrest. They needed closure. And so, despite the glaring flaws, they decided to go ahead and officially charge Colin Stagg with the murder of Rachel Nichol. It was the kind of news that made headlines within minutes. Rachel's family got the call. Finally, after so many long and painful months, someone was being held responsible. It felt like justice was on its way. It felt like they could finally start to heal. Andre Hanscom, Rachel's partner and the father of their son, Alex, had been living in France by then. He'd made the difficult decision to leave the UK and raise Alex elsewhere, somewhere quieter, somewhere he wouldn't be known as the toddler who watched his mother get murdered. Andre didn't want his child growing up in the shadow of that trauma, surrounded by media, whispers, and cruel headlines. He wanted a fresh start. But even after the move to France, the story followed them. British police somehow found out where they lived and showed up at their doorstep. Andre was shaken. He just wanted to protect his son. So he packed up and moved them again, this time to Barcelona. where he hoped they could finally live in peace. But on that day, when he got the phone call telling him that someone had finally been charged for Rachel's murder, he didn't hesitate. He was ecstatic. After everything, all the pain, all the waiting, he believed justice was finally being done. Colin Stagg's trial began in late 1994, nearly 2 years after Rachel Nichols' murder. The courtroom was tense, the media were swarming, and emotions ran high. But almost immediately, something unexpected happened. The judge presiding over the case took serious issue with the way the police had handled the investigation, particularly Operation Edsel. From the start, the judge made it clear. He believed the operation was unethical to a disturbing degree. He was horrified that officers had essentially offered sex in exchange for a murder confession. That wasn't investigation. That was coercion. That was a setup. The judge pointed out something critical. What if Colin Stagg hadn't been the killer, and he gave a false confession anyway, just because he thought it would win him the affection of the woman he was falling for? It wasn't far-fetched. It could have happened. The only reason it didn't happen was because Colin, for all his loneliness, never actually confessed. But the fact that it could have happened at all, that was enough for the judge to make a bold decision. He threw it out. Every word, every letter, every recording, every park date. The entirety of Operation Edsel was ruled inadmissible in court. It wasn't real evidence, the judge said. It was entrapment. It was manipulation. And it was wrong. Without it, the prosecution was left with almost nothing. Their case now hinged almost entirely on the original criminal profile created by Paul Britton in the earliest days of the investigation. That profile had led them to Colin Stagg, and it seemed to fit him perfectly. But the truth was, it was just a theory, a best guess. Profiles aren't evidence, they're psychological sketches. And as the defense pointed out, there were likely millions of men in the world who could fit that same profile. They didn't have DNA. They didn't have eyewitnesses. They didn't even have a confession. All they had left was a theory. Though there would be millions of people on the earth that would potentially fit that criminal profile, there was still that circumstantial evidence, of course. Colin Stagg had been in Wimbledon Common on the very day that Rachel Nichols was murdered. Not just the same day, but right around the same time. That was something police couldn't ignore. And then there was the other thing, the indecent exposure charge. A sex offense. It didn't paint a pretty picture, that's for sure. It made him look disturbing, untrustworthy, maybe even dangerous. But still, that wasn't the same as being a killer. Being guilty of flashing in a public park isn't the same as being guilty of murder. The police knew that, and yet they also knew it was one of the few things they had left. With Operation Edsel now thrown out entirely, the already fragile case they'd built against Colin was unraveling fast. The core of their argument, all those months of letters, all the recordings, all the undercover work, was gone. And what remained? 2 or 3 loose threads. A few odd coincidences. A weak pattern. It wasn't going to be enough. Deep down, they all knew it. So in 1994, Colin Stagg was acquitted of the murder of Rachel Nichols. Just like that, he walked free. The court ruled that there was nowhere near enough evidence to say, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Colin had anything to do with Rachel's murder. They couldn't prove it. And in the eyes of the law, that meant one thing. He was innocent. He could go home. But the public didn't see it that way. Not even close. Because in the eyes of the media, and by extension the entire country, Colin Stagg had already been tried and convicted long ago. His face had been plastered on every front page for months. Sex offender, suspected murderer, pervert killer. They'd burned his name into the public's memory. They'd shaped the story, and they weren't about to rewrite it just because of some judge's ruling. So even after he was acquitted, even after the court made it clear that he wasn't guilty, they kept printing it anyway. Colin Stagg, the man who got away with murder. They said he was dangerous, that he was going to strike again. Some tabloids even suggested he was a serial killer just waiting for his next victim. And the police, with their main suspect, now legally free and cleared of all charges, they shrugged. There wasn't much more they could do. They'd poured everything into this case, spent years chasing Colin Stagg, poured millions of pounds of taxpayer money into this investigation. 3 million pounds, to be exact. And it all led to nothing. They'd failed to build a strong case. They'd failed to get a conviction. And now, they weren't about to go back to square one. In their eyes, Colin Stagg was still the killer. They just couldn't prove it. And without more evidence, their hands were tied. So they gave up. They didn't reopen the investigation. They didn't look for new leads. They didn't consider other suspects. They just stopped. As far as they were concerned, Rachel's case was over. Even if it technically stayed open on the books, the reality was clear. The police had moved on. And for Rachel Nichols' family, that was utterly devastating. For 2 years, they'd held out hope. They'd waited while the police ran this huge sting operation. They thought justice was finally coming. But now it has all collapsed. Colin Stagg walked away, and there was no one else in the frame. No one else is being questioned. No new information. Just silence. 3 million pounds gone. 2 years of headlines. And now nothing. And the worst part? Whoever had killed Rachel Nichols was still out there. Free. Unnoticed. Maybe looking for another victim. Maybe I've already found one. And for the next decade, this murder that happened in 1992 remained unsolved. It was a cold case for a decade. I can't imagine how awful that was for her family, to know that not only was she not getting any justice, but Rachel's killer was out there, potentially looking for another victim, potentially having other victims, and police just might not have known about it. On the 10-year anniversary of Rachel Nichols' murder, something shifted. The case, which had been left to gather dust, forgotten by investigators, and largely abandoned by the Met, was suddenly everywhere again. The media lit up with it. Every front page, every nightly news bulletin, every major radio station. Remember this case? They asked. It's been a decade, and there's still no justice. Police haven't caught her killer. They failed. And just like that, the pressure that had once overwhelmed the early investigation came flooding back. It was the same old scrutiny, but now with an edge. A decade had passed. There are no excuses left. People wanted answers, and they wanted them fast. The Met felt it. Hard. But this time, the case wasn't in the hands of the original detectives who had chased Colin Stagg into a corner with nothing but a psychological profile and a long con. No, this was a new team. A fresh generation of officers. Most of them hadn't been involved back in 1992, and they were coming in clean with no biases, no baggage, and a mandate to get it right. They made a bold decision. They would start everything from scratch. This wouldn't be a light rear view. They were going to reopen the entire Rachel Nichols file, as if the case had just landed on their desk that morning. They weren't going to treat it like a cold case. They were going to treat it like a new one. Every piece of evidence, every statement, every photograph, every page of interview transcripts, even the infamous letters from Colin Stagg, they went back over all of it, line by line, word by word. And then they found something. Back in 1992, early in the original investigation, forensic teams had recovered a very small piece of DNA evidence from Rachel's body. At the time, it hadn't been usable. The technology simply wasn't there yet. It was too small a sample to test. So they shelved it, preserved it, filed it away with the hope that one day science would catch up. That day had come. It was now 2002, and DNA technology had advanced enormously. What had once been untouchable was now testable. This tiny sliver of biological material might finally tell them something. So they ran the test. The first step was simple. Identify whether the DNA belonged to Rachel herself. It didn't. Then they checked against the people closest to her, her partner Andre and her son, little Alex, who had been right there during the attack. It wasn't them either. What they did know was that the DNA came from a man who had left some trace of himself on Rachel's body during or around the time of the murder. And suddenly, hope sparked again. This could be it. This could be the key to unlocking everything. To be completely sure, police did the next logical thing. They brought Colin Stagg back in. One last time, they explained what they'd found, that they had DNA from the crime scene, and they asked him to provide a sample. They wanted to compare the two once and for all, because in their minds, this still had to be him. After everything, all the letters, all the undercover meetings, all the uncomfortable fantasies, they still believed they had the right man. They just hadn't been able to prove it. Now, they had a chance to prove it with science. So Colin gave his DNA, and they tested it, and it didn't match. It didn't even come close. The DNA found on Rachel Nichols' body belonged to someone else entirely. Someone still unknown. Someone still out there. And in that moment, that one tiny final result, everything changed. This officially cleared Colin Stagg of the murder. He was innocent. It wasn't him all along. Just as he'd been saying, he had been adamant that he never killed anyone, and no one listened. Colin Stagg was eventually awarded £700,000 in compensation. That was the amount the government decided would make up for what he'd been put through, for the years of media hell, for the weight of being wrongly accused of one of the most horrific murders in British memory, for the total dismantling of his life. £700,000. On paper, that's a life-changing amount. That's $750,000. It sounds like a win. But how do you really put a price on being hated by your entire country for over a decade? How do you measure the damage of waking up every day for 10 years and knowing that when people look at you, they see a monster, a murderer, a danger? How many people crossed the street when they saw him coming? How many jobs never called back? How many friendships never started? How many relationships never had the chance to even begin? Because who wants to date the guy who's been accused of killing a woman in front of her child? Even after he was acquitted, even after the courts cleared him, that stigma never fully left him. His name was burned into the public imagination. Colin Stagg, the man who was probably guilty, according to headlines that refused to let go. The man they believed got away with murder. The media painted that picture so vividly that even the truth couldn't erase it. And then there was Operation Edsel. That year-long manipulation. The woman he thought he was building something with, someone who seemed to finally see him, to be interested in him, to share his fantasies. All fake, all scripted, all designed by a police task force desperate for a confession. They used every word he wrote against him, every feeling, every vulnerable moment. They let him believe he was finally connecting with someone, and then revealed it had all been a lie. That it wasn't just her, it was an entire room full of officers, reading every letter he sent like a piece of evidence, picking it apart, laughing at him, judging him, strategizing their next move, and then turning around and charging him with murder. So yes, £700,000 is a lot of money, but it's hard to imagine any amount that could truly undo all of that. Still, Colin tried to make the best of it. He used the money to build something, not just for himself, but for the people around him. He invested it wisely, took his family on holiday to Cornwall, which honestly feels like the bare minimum he deserved after everything. Some peace by the sea, a few quiet weekends on the South Coast where no one looked at him like he was a killer. And before we go further into this case, because there's still more to tell, I just want to give you this small piece of good news. After everything, Colin found some joy again. He's now married, or at least he was about to be, last we heard. I think they tied the knot by now. He has a family, stepchildren who love him, who call him dad. He's happy. He's stable. He has love. He has support. And thanks to the compensation, he was finally able to live a life that didn't revolve around survival. He even said once, in an interview, that if none of this had happened, if he hadn't been wrongfully arrested and dragged through the press, he believes he'd still be on benefits and unemployed today. And that's a wild thing to admit, but also maybe a glimpse into how completely his life was upended and then rebuilt. So if you can even call it a happy ending, he had as close to one as possible. So anyway, now back to the timeline. By this point, Colin Stagg had been officially cleared. It was a monumental moment, not just because it lifted the burden off his shoulders, but because it meant something bigger for the investigation. He was the only suspect police had ever truly focused on. For 10 whole years, every ounce of their energy, every strand of Operation Edsel, every line of questioning and court appearance, it all revolved around Colin. And now, just like that, he was off the table, which meant they were back at square one. Completely. Totally. After a decade. And it's just frustrating. Painful even, because they had poured so many years into chasing the wrong man, following a lead that was more illusion than evidence. If they had simply kept their minds open from the very beginning, if they'd just been willing to entertain the idea that maybe Colin wasn't their guy, they could have caught Rachel's killer in those crucial early days. They could have saved a decade of anguish, of dead ends, of false hope. But tunnel vision is a dangerous thing. It narrows your view so much that the rest of the world and all the possible answers within it just fades out. And that's exactly what happened here. While they obsessed over Colin, the real killer was out there. Free, living, possibly hurting others. Still, despite the missteps, they did have one thing left. That small piece of DNA. You remember, back in 1992, a tiny sample had been recovered from Rachel's body. It was minute, too small for any real analysis with the forensic tech available at the time. So it was stored away, preserved like a time capsule for the future, just in case technology ever caught up. And in 2002, things had changed. They finally had the means to test it. So they ran it through. First, they confirmed it didn't belong to Rachel. Of course. Then they tested it against her partner, Andre, and their son Alex, just to rule them out completely. It wasn't a match to either of them. What they didn't know, though, was that it was male DNA, and that in itself was something. It was hope. At first, police assumed, almost wanted it to match Colin Stagg. It would have validated everything they'd worked toward for years. But when they tested his DNA against a sample, nothing. No match, which officially, scientifically, undeniably cleared him. The DNA didn't belong to anyone they knew. Not yet. Because even though forensic science had made great strides by 2002, it still wasn't at the point where they could just feed DNA into a database and get a name instantly. It didn't work like in the movies. Back then, it was still a waiting game. So they waited. They sat on the results. They held on to that small strand of genetic evidence like a lifeline, something to carry them forward when the time was right. And then, in 2006, everything changed. Exactly as they'd hoped, forensic technology took another leap forward. Suddenly, it was possible to scan that DNA against a national system, the National Criminal Database. If you're unfamiliar, that database is like the genetic archive of Britain's violent offenders. Every individual who had ever been arrested or charged with a violent crime had their DNA on file. Their fingerprints, their entire forensic footprint, sitting there waiting for the day a mystery needed solving. So the police now had a plan. They hoped that Rachel's killer had struck again. Not because they wanted more violence, of course, but because it would mean that person had ended up in the system. It would mean the database might finally speak. They ran the DNA, and they got a hit. The sample matched a man already in the system, a name that would change everything. And that is where I will leave it for part 2 of this case. Another cliffhanger. But you know, part 3, the final part, will be coming out in the next couple of days. So make sure you've got my notification bell on so you don't miss when I upload.